Okay, all right. So you're all here for SharePoint administration, right? Oh, good, all right. My vanity slide is first. That's me. I am Todd Clint. I've been a SharePoint MVP for a bunch of years now. Kind of forgot when that whole thing started, 2006 or so. The MVP program, for those of you that aren't familiar with it, is not necessarily about how smart you are, as if you'll all be very aware of that very quickly, if you haven't already. But it has to do with community outreach and helping the community and that kind of stuff. So Shane and I are both MVPs. We get that from doing events like this, writing blogs, writing books. This fine piece of literature came out last month. A bunch of you already have it. For those of you that did not have it, because it sold out in the bookstore, you couldn't buy it, we're going to be giving this very copy away here in a few minutes, so pay attention. Don't nod off just yet. You're going to want to stay awake. I've got a blog. I'm pretty good about making sure everybody remembers that I've got a blog, but there's the URL. That's the first reference to that. Shane and I used to work for a company called SharePoint 911, and we were purchased by Rackspace a year and a half ago. You can still go to the SharePoint 911 site if you don't want to try to find the SharePoint stuff on the Rackspace website. You can email me, todd.clint@rackspace.com, or hit me up on Twitter. Feel free to ask me questions and all that. The easier the question, the more likely you're going to get a response, just so you know. People get very apologetic. They're like, oh, I've got a really dumb question. The good thing about dumb questions is they're really easy to answer. So I'm a big fan of dumb questions. You can hit me up there. Also on Monday nights at 8:30 Central, I do a live SharePoint podcast, and you can watch it live. There's a chat room. You can heckle me in real time. And then it's up on my blog. You can download the archives, but I do that also on Monday. So love to see any of you there that want to show up.
So my name is Shane Young. I am a lot of the same things Todd said, other than I've been an MVP longer than Todd.
9 months.
It's always important to keep in mind. Same deal, we've written the books, we do teach training classes, we do consulting, we do product work. We're pretty much hardcore SharePoint nerds, but one of the keys to our hardcore SharePoint nerdiness is that we're admin nerds. So when Todd's talking about asking hard questions, if you say, hey, how do I compile code? He's got nothing for you there, right? We don't do dev stuff.
Nothing but mocking and ridicule. That's what I have for developers. Yeah.
Firewalls, AD, Exchange, SQL, Windows Server stuff. That's our bag.
Yep.
So there's my email address, my blog, which is woefully underutilized. Unlike some people, I don't blog every week to say, hey, I'm still blogging this week.
People miss me when I'm gone. It's a true story.
I only blog
my mom starts to wonder if I'm okay. She calls.
Your biggest fan.
Yep.
Things like, how do I install SQL Server? I write really long, helpful blog posts instead of, hi, Mom. So there's a website. I'm on Twitter as well. And also, we have a hashtag for this session. It is Todd Stinks. So if you want to tweet with your fellow participants about what's going on in this session or follow-ups after the session, #Todd Stinks. So the first year that we did that, it was actually in this room.
It was in this very room the first time I told that joke, yeah.
I told him we had this one set of jokes. But we actually got it to trend on Twitter for a couple minutes, so you guys get to work, quit listening to us. Todd Stinks, enter. Todd Stinks, enter. So.
Yep, that way you can all connect.
All right, so now that we've gotten to the climax, let's give them the book, and then they can all take off and go find another session to watch.
Yep, you can all go take it. So, for those of you that have been at a session with us before, and we see a lot of familiar faces in the crowd, you know what's coming up, everybody's favorite part of our sessions, where we give away stuff and we play a little game known as Heads or Tails. So if you want a copy of this book that may or may not be signed, if you'd like it or not, you need to stand up. You're on the honor system. I've never been called out like that before.
He called you out.
We just talked about that.
No elevator. You make a game where he's got to stand up. You are a jerk.
I'm insensitive. There's no getting around it. All right, so we're going to play Heads or Tails. So Shane's got a coin. It's been independently verified to have both a head and a tail. Take your right hand, put it on your head or your tail. Shane's going to flip the coin. If your head is where matches the coin, you get to stand up. And we recycle till we have one person left, and they are the proud winner of the book. It is an American quarter, vintage 1977.
Oh, it's a 1974. That can kind of throw off the odds a little bit.
It's my birth year.
All right, everybody, heads or tails?
Heads
Your
or
own
tails?
tail, not your neighbor's tail. I know.
Unless you work something out. We're not going to judge.
All right, ready?
See a lot of heads in the crowd.
I don't want you to read.
You know,
You have bad breath. Ross, what do we got?
It's tails.
Tails.
oh,
So all the
that might be
heads down.
That might be the second time in Shane's life he's flipped a tail coming out of the chute.
That's about accurate. All right, let's go again. Heads or tails?
Heads or tails? What did you have? Tails? Of course you did.
All right, here we go. Heads or tails? Let's see. Ross, you had a chance to keep yourself up. You didn't. So, George, what do you got?
Tails.
See, George calls what he's doing. All right, heads or tails? Oh, there's the big mass move to heads.
Oh.
Let's see. I gotta go find me someone different. George cheats, I can tell. Is that Adam?
Tails.
Tails. Adam didn't know the rule about calling your own thing. All right. You know,
So
I don't doubt you questioning me.
She asked if that was a trick coin, if it only had tails. We did this a couple years ago and we didn't have a coin. And someone from Canada gave us one of their coins. It has a head on both sides. And we didn't know it. So he flipped it twice and had heads, and he flipped it the third time and it was the other head. And I'm like, I don't know what to do now because it's all heads.
It's a true story. That's not a made up one. All right, we ready? Heads or tails? Let's see some of you people. You look a little sketchy up there. I got to walk all the way to this guy now. Oh, what's your name? You got to move your hand. I can't. Jeff, hi.
That is heads.
Heads. See, Jeff.
How many do we got left now? 2, 4, 5, 6.
Pretty close.
All right, 7.
All right, heads or tails?
Can you guys feel the excitement? Are you getting nervous? It's like the last hour in that surface line. You're almost there.
All right. Ed, what we got, buddy?
That'd be heads.
Heads, Ed says. See, Ed knows how the game works. Way down.
right.
3, 4.
4.
Ooh.
So 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. Okay. So we got 1 tail and 3 heads.
All right.
Sir. I'm pulling for you.
It's tails.
Big winner in the back.
There we
All
go.
right, come on down.
Whose quarter did I steal? Yeah, I didn't bring a quarter. I didn't come prepared.
They don't want it back. We're keeping it. Yeah. There you go.
Cheating is not
Congratulations.
above our audience. All right. So anyway, it's always a fun little game to play. If you guys are ever, speaking and you want to get people to wake up for a minute.
Or suck up to them by giving them free stuff.
Yeah, fill out your evals right now, please.
Yeah.
Okay, so in this session, really what we're going to try and do is we're going to go over the basis of what you need to know to do to get your environment up and running. So kind of cover some install stuff, some topology stuff, some prerequisite stuff.
Yep. For those of you who noticed, we actually pitched them 2 parts to this, and they took 1 of them. So we tried to take the stuff that we were going to do in the 2 sessions and get it down into the 1 session. So it's going to be some stuff that, what's new, things to know about if you're a seasoned 2010 administrator moving to 2013, and then just kind of some general getting off on the right foot stuff. But it's kind of compressed because we thought we were going to have 2 sessions.
Yeah. Also, if you did our Sunday pre-con, I'd say it's probably a 30 to 40% overlap, so you will see some of the same stuff again.
But again, on Sunday, if it's anything we did in the afternoon, you were probably in line for the Surface, so you probably missed it the first time anyway. So it's a good reminder.
All right. So SharePoint and its friends. As you probably all already know, SharePoint has to run on top of our friend Windows Server. 2008 R2, SP1, 2012. Those are both 64-bit, so it's no real tough one there. One of the key things, though, is that SharePoint will do all the hard work for you. So when you're building a SharePoint server, all you really do is install Windows, patch it, add it to your domain, and you're good, right? You don't have to go configure IIS or .NET or any of those pieces. It's really just get it up and running and attach. Because SharePoint's got a prerequisite installer we'll talk about in a minute, and that prerequisite installer is going to do all the heavy lifting.
Yep. Except for the light lifting at the end that it does not do. Starting the proud tradition in SharePoint 2010, we've got the prerequisite installer, and continuing that tradition, it didn't install all the prerequisites, and 2013 follows in those footsteps. So we've got the blog post at the end that has the extra prerequisites you have to install after you install the prerequisites, and they are OS patches, and there's a couple of them for Windows 2008 R2 and one for Windows 2012 that you'll need to put on. If you didn't do this, you have to format all your machines and start over. No, I'm kidding. You can just put the patch on whenever, it's no big deal. And also, since these are Windows patches, there's a good chance at some point they're going to get rolled up into something else. So 3 or 4 months from now, if you're installing SharePoint and you go to install that prerequisite and tells you that it's not applicable to your system or something, don't freak out. It just means that the OS has already installed it for you. So don't worry about them.
So when it comes to SQL Server, this is, when you're planning your SharePoint farm, right, this is no different than 2007 or 2010, but you've got to really, SQL Server is the most important key. Right? Todd and I have probably done 150, 200 server audits over the years.
Make it 1,000. Yeah.
And I can tell you, short of a customer saying, yeah, I've only got like 2 gigs of RAM in my SharePoint server, the number one performance bottleneck is always SQL Server.
And I did, with Windows, or with SharePoint 2010, did have a customer who called up and said that SharePoint, they were having a lot of problems with SharePoint, and I got on the server. It had 2 gig of RAM on a SharePoint server, 2010.
Let's avoid that one.
In that case, SQL was not the bottleneck. It was the constantly recycling application pools that was the problem.
So when you're looking at SQL, SQL 2008 R2, SP1 or later will work. SQL Server 2012. From a pure SharePoint core functionality standpoint, I don't have a strong preference between R2 and 2012. Now, there's a lot of different things that they will do, if you get into the different packs and things that are kind of make SharePoint, that help support your SharePoint infrastructure better, but SharePoint features don't turn on differently based on 2008 or 2012.
Outside of BI.
Outside of BI. Now, if you're going to do anything with BI, so Power Pivot, Performance Point, Power
Access
View,
services.
Access services, Excel services. If you're going to use any of those where they use the word power or point in some conjunction, you're going to have to use SQL 2012 SP1. But that's really the only time that it matters is if you're doing those BI scenarios.
And you only need to use SQL 2012 for those pieces of SharePoint. So you could have your content databases in SQL 2008 R2 and the BI stuff in SQL 2012. The reason we bring that up is because I don't know if you guys have noticed, SQL licenses are kind of spendy. And so depending on how you've got things, if you virtualize, sometimes you get SQL instances built into that. So you can have your content databases on one SQL instance and your BI stuff running on another, if that has to happen.
Yeah.
And again, this is where your performance comes from. We're talking about you want a SQL box that's got plenty of RAM, plenty of CPU. You want your drives laid out intelligently, things like that, because everything in SharePoint is coming out of SQL or going into SQL. So SQL has to be happy for SharePoint to be happy.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yes, sir. So we asked what we consider adequate. One of the documents we're going to link later has the hardware requirement minimums for SQL for SharePoint. So is it in Sundays? Yeah, it's buried in the SharePoint hardware requirements doc. The SQL requirements are in there too. And I forget what it is, 8 or 12 gig of RAM and 4 cores or something. But it's in that document. So the problem with SQL for me is I'm not real good at performance tuning in SQL. So SQL does things like it takes all the RAM, whether it needs it or not, and caches things. But I'm not real good at troubleshooting that kind of stuff. So I don't know. I can't tell when SQL's really stressed and when it's not. So I don't know where those limits are.
Yeah, and really when it comes to investing in SQL Server, it's all about disk, right? So all of the SQL performance tuning stuff that you've ever heard about, separating the data and the log files, that makes a big deal for SharePoint. It also turns out that one of the SQL Server databases is called TempDB. And the way that I think of TempDB is it's kind of like, I hate to use the same analogy I use for a state service, but that's the way I think of it. It's where SQL Server writes things on its hand, right? So when SQL Server is doing, large queries, or it's trying to do a big sort, or things like that, it uses a tempdb to kind of hold, write it on its hand for a minute, like, okay, I got to remember this, finish doing this, okay, I wrote this. So the tempdb is kind of this permanent in and out space. And so what we have found is that with SharePoint especially, if you can really only tune one database, tempdb is that database. So the more you can optimize the disk I/O in tempdb, if you're really on a shoestring budget, the better off you're going to be, because things like search just crush tempdb and really all the activity, but search is one of my favorites for abusive behavior.
And this brings up an interesting thing. You can't do SharePoint well without doing SQL well, but none of us have time to do SQL well. So one of the people that I go to when I have questions is a guy named Paul Randall, and he blogs at SQLskills.com. He used to work at Microsoft, used to be on the SQL Server database engine team, so the guy knows a little bit about SQL. And I've been talking to Paul for years about this, and he knows I'm from the SharePoint side, so he always yells at me about all the terrible things that SharePoint does to his SQL servers. But one of the things that he has done, his company has now started a class for who he calls accidental DBAs. So the SQL Skills, and I don't remember the full URL, but if you go there, they have a class for people like you who don't want to be SQL folks, but have to know how to use SQL. So he's got one of those coming up at the end of the year. So if you've got any training money left, you might think about that, because he's going to talk about stuff like tempdb, but without getting too deep and without making it hurt your head if you're not a SQL person. So good place to get up to speed.
Another one of the SQL things that we used to do a great job of saying that we don't say enough anymore is when it comes to SQL Server databases in SharePoint, right, they're not real SQL databases. So, if you've got the DBA back in the office who's like, hey, I like to go in, my job is to tune databases, right? I'm going to go in and update the index statistics and reformat the partition tables and change the page size. You tell them to stay the hell away from your SharePoint databases.
Slap their hands. Rulers.
I cannot tell you how many support calls we've gotten over the years where the call starts out with, well, yeah, our SQL DBA went in and fixed the database, and now nothing works. Best example ever was I had a customer that wanted to upgrade from 2003 to 2007, and at some point their SQL Server had ran out of disk space, which is probably the worst thing that can ever happen to a SQL database, is being written to when it just hits the brick wall of no more disk space. You think they would check for that, but whatever. When that happened, it corrupted the database, so the DBA swooped in, and fixed it. And they ran in that state for the next 2 years until I came around to do the upgrade. Well, I said, all right, step one for the upgrade is you need to back the database up, restore it to a test server so I can try and play with your upgrade. Yeah, backups don't work on that database anymore.
Is that a big deal when backups don't work? I can't, because I don't back databases up very often, so.
So I'm like, well, I kind of started to get pieces of the story at that point. And so what he had done was when he went in to fix the database, he'd ran all of his little cute fixie-up routines and tried to normalize the database. SharePoint is not a normalized database. There's 75 gigs of SharePoint content they had when it was all said and done, and I got rid of all the orphan data, so data where the parent pointer was missing, but I still had the underlying documents. You pretty much just blow that away in SharePoint. They got down to 23 gigs. They lost 2/3 of their database because the DBA fixed it, and they didn't have any backups. So don't let your DBAs touch your SQL databases is really the moral of the story.
Yeah, and if you have any DBAs that have touched SQL, they're going to tell you horror stories about all the terrible things that SharePoint does. One of the most egregious is it uses GUIDs as primary keys in a couple of tables, which DBAs, they just cringe. I mean, it makes them want to vomit blood when they hear that. But it's because of those weird things that they don't normally do is the reason they need to stay out of those databases, because SharePoint has some expectations. So stay out of those databases.
Any questions on SQL? I know we just threw a lot of random things there. All right. So SharePoint production hardware. Really, storage space is probably one of our big ones.
So as Shane and I have been doing this talk for SharePoint for 6 years now, something like that. I mean, this is like the third version of SharePoint we've done this talk on. And the biggest change, I think, from this slide's aspect from 6 years ago is virtualization. So 6 years ago when we did this slide, we're like, you need to have a C drive that is X gig. And that meant for the company going out and buying a pair of those drives and mirroring them and having a RAID 5 and all that. But these days, everything's virtualized. All of you guys are going to install SharePoint on virtualized servers. It's just the way of the world. which is not a bad thing, but one thing it's made people be is very stingy about hardware. Because now if I make that C drive on SharePoint 100 gig, it takes 100 gig of space. But if I make it 50 gig, well, that's just 50 gig I can give another VM. I can spin up more VMs. So it's made people really stingy about drive space. Don't be stingy on drive space with SharePoint. The minimum requirements set up by Microsoft are 80 gig. The minimum requirements for Windows 7 for memory is 1 gig of RAM. What do we do when we look at the hardware minimums for Windows 7? We point at them and we laugh. And then we use like 10 times that amount. Use that same mentality when looking at these hardware minimums for SharePoint. You really need 80 gig. Not because SharePoint needs it, but because Windows needs it. You guys all have SharePoint servers now that are 3 and 4 years old that have been getting patches and all kinds of stuff. Windows is going to chew that space up. So make sure you have it. Again, it says 80. We say 100, 120 if you can get it. And then we're also going to tell you to have a secondary drive, an E drive, a D drive, whatever. And everything that is responsible to move off to that drive, do so. ULS logs, usage logs, IIS logs, temp directories. If you're running search, your query files, all that kind of stuff. Get everything off of that C drive that you can. Windows gets really fussy when the C drive gets full. And it makes it tough to get into Windows to fix it if the C drive's full. So.
Now, one of the important stories or points when it comes to the second drive is that all the servers in your farm need to have the same drive letters. Right? So you've got 3 SharePoint servers, and you're like, hey, I got a C drive, I'm going to put an E drive on this one, I want to do an F drive on that one. You're going to cause yourselves a lot of nightmares. One of the biggest ones is if you think about when you go in and adjust like the logging settings in Central Admin, right? What are you doing? You're changing the farm settings so that it goes from the C drive to the E drive. What happens if a server doesn't have an E drive? Well, luckily, it just stops logging, which is not the end of the world, but kind of annoying. But what really bites you in the butt is if you go and add a server to that farm, 6 months later, and it doesn't have an E drive, what happens? You get this awful file I/O exception error message. And the first time it happens to you, it takes about 40 hours to figure out that the reason you can't install SharePoint is because it doesn't have an E drive, right? Because what happens is when you run the wizard, it says, oh, provision the log files in the E drive, and they don't have a good catch exception there. So when it can't find an E drive, instead of just skipping the logs like the rest of SharePoint does, the add me to a farm configuration wizard just bombs out. So you end up formatting the box, or in the case of VMs, blowing the VM away. But you end up trying to rebuild, like I must have installed Windows wrong, right? Because that's a pretty hard task these days. Yep. Next.
Next. Don't forget to rename it so all your servers aren't Windash.
So I guess I point that out. We're big fans of second drives, but you've got to be smart with those drive letters. You can't do it willy-nilly. You use your kids' initials like you normally do.
Yep. To extend on that, they have to be the same letters. They don't have to be the same size.
Yes.
So if you've got if you've decided your query boxes, all the index files are going to go on the F drive, you might give that box a 100 gig F drive, but give your web front ends a 10 gig F drive. Just so that SharePoint, because we've seen it happen in a couple places, things get moved around, and all those file locations, like Shane said, are at the farm level. So you don't get to pick which stuff goes on which machine. So just make sure the letters are the same, but don't have to be the same size. We're going to say 4 cores. That's an honest thing. You really do need 4 cores, especially if you've got search running anywhere. Search has this nasty habit of spawning node runner processes like it's its job. And so you need to get those farmed out. You really do need 4 cores. Memory, depending on how you've got things set up, you need between 8 or 12. 12 for a production server that's just running SharePoint is a good minimum. I like it. You've got things like the distributed cache, which are going to take 10% off the top. You've got search and all that stuff, so plan for 12 gig.
Yeah, and RAM is one of those things that on a web front end, right, you almost can't have enough. I mean, and one of the things that we don't have a slide on, but we'll kind of talk a little bit about real quick, is that there's some documentation out there. Right now it's all still for SharePoint 2010, but it talks about the different server roles that you want to run and kind of the hardware footprints for the different ones. The reason that's important, so when we think about like the web front end, right, he likes to chew up RAM, he likes to cache everything. Search servers, just like every resource known to man, they're very greedy. But like if you're going to do Excel scenarios, right, BI stuff, most of the BI stuff is all CPU. So you need to kind of look at your workloads. It's not a one-size-fits-all unless you're a small deployment, but those larger deployments, You don't want to have 10 servers with the same specs. If you're going to break up into different tiers and stuff. Web front ends have one set of specs, search servers have another set of specs, and then the app servers have a different hardware profile. In a lot of cases, Todd talked about we virtualize everything these days. It's real easy for me to convince you to do search servers as physical boxes still these days. They are just so violent. The more hardware you can get on them, the better.
Yeah, and that's one of those things, if you have indexes that take a really long time, days for your full index to run, those are the kind of situations where you want to put it on physical hardware and things like that, because search is an animal. It's terrible. Also, for the network, you want to have at least 1 gigabit network between all of the boxes involved in SharePoint, SQL boxes, SharePoint servers. Also have to be within 1 millisecond latency of each other. As the product has gotten bigger and more interconnected, that has become more important, because things are talking to each other and service apps are talking. And if you start getting machines that are in a different data center or things like that, you start having problems. So make sure you've got that. The 10 gigabit network stuff's coming out. It's out. We've got it in data centers. It's not a bad idea if you've got it. You can't have too much network pipe. So.
Yeah. Well, so one of the important things, there's a lot that is actually said in that last bullet point, gigabit Ethernet. Because a lot of times we get questions like, well, hey, I want to do a stretched farm, right? I got an office here in Atlanta, or not in Atlanta, here in New Orleans, and I got an office in Windsor, Canada, right? Look at that, I'm using my international friends. And people are like, well, can I just have the farm in New Orleans, but then have one of the web front ends up in Canada? So the way that we always answer that question is just, hey, can you get gigabit Ethernet between the two with less than a millisecond of latency? No? Then no, you cannot, right? So every time that someone tries to get creative with you and they start saying, oh, I can do blah and blah, all you have to do is look at that one bullet point and say, is it gigabit and 1 millisecond? Turns out that 1 millisecond, the speed of light, some fancy calculations on the back of Todd's hand, it's about 40 miles is as far as two servers can physically be apart and get 1 millisecond of latency.
Now, the good news is the Canadians are probably going to be too polite to complain about SharePoint being slow. So if they can't have that server in Ontario, they're probably...
I think it's because of Tim Hortons. I kind of want a donut, actually.
All, yeah. But yeah, that's a real deal. And you'll start seeing weird things. We had a customer that tried this, and they had timer jobs that failed randomly and things like that, because they were trying to be clever, trying to get their servers a little farther apart. This always comes up because people want SharePoint to be geographically dispersed because of things like he's talking about. You've got 2 offices, and it's not real obvious which one everything should go at, so you kind of want to split things up, and you want SharePoint to understand that. SharePoint just doesn't understand that. There is no magic bullet. Shane and I do this stuff all the time, and for Rackspace now we've got data centers in different locations. Customers ask for this. There is just no good way to do geo-replicated SharePoint. There just isn't. There's a couple of third parties out there that do it. If that's important to you, beware. Not very many people like any geo-replication stuff they're using with SharePoint. And also beware, every one of those products does one thing well or a couple of things well. Some are really big on the content, the list items and that kind of stuff, but they miss the branding, the presentation. Some are really good about making sure that SharePoint looks the same, so it's the pages and all that, but the data stuff takes a while. So be very careful if you're going to look at any of that stuff. I've not seen one I'm in love with. So here's, I talked to you again. For those, again, we see a lot of familiar faces in the crowd. When we started doing this talk however many years ago, we had a slide on virtualization. And we're like, never virtualize SQL. Never virtualize your search servers unless you absolutely have to. If you have to virtualize something, you can virtualize your WFEs. We won't make too much fun of you, but that's the only thing you can virtualize. Here we are 5 years later, everything's virtualized up one side and down the other. We lost that battle.
For the record, I still hate the idea of virtualizing SQL Server. I'm still against it.
So the thing now is everything's virtualized for good or for bad, but don't be stingy. And that line initially said don't be stupid, but we thought stingy played better. So when you're virtualizing anything, but specifically SQL, don't do some of the dumb things in virtualization. Don't thin provision your SQL drives. So thin provisioning means SQL, the VM, thinks it has a terabyte drive, but on the back end at the virtualization host, it's got a 100 gig drive that grows as it needs to expand. That causes some problems. It causes speed problems. And where does all of our speed come from? SQL. Causes speed problems, but it also causes some hysterical hardware contention issues. So I had a customer that was doing this, and they were going to upgrade from 2007 to 2010. So I set up a call for them, get online with them doing a GoToMeeting thing, and what was the first thing we were going to do? We're going to back up their 2007 content database, restore it, attach it to a SharePoint 2010 farm, and kind of see where the problems were. I'm on the production SQL box. Production SQL box. Database is 7 gig, this many. So I back it up to a drive that had like 50 gig free. About 20% into the backup, we lose the RDP session. It just goes away. And the guy's like, what just happened? I'm like, I don't know, it's your server. I don't know what's going on.
Why would I, the consultant, know what's going on?
Yeah, I don't even work here. He said, well, is our backup still going? I'm like, well, I don't know. If it's a network thing, maybe, I don't know. So then, as we're sitting here waiting for this to come back, trying 1 out of 20, 2 out of 20, his phone rings. Email's down. And then somebody stops by his office. SharePoint's down. What had happened was they had thin provisioned the data drive on that SQL box. And they had about 10 servers, production servers, all virtualized on there, and they were all thin provisioned. So my backup, my 7 gig backup, filled up the host drive, and every VM shut down. SQL shut down, email shut down, SharePoint shut down. Every one of them paused just like that because the drive on the server ran out of space. And so then everybody's all freaking out. So he goes next door, he talks to the virtualization guy, they figure it out. The virtualization guy cleans up some space, we're all good to go, fires all the VMs back up. Anybody want to guess what happened the next time I started that backup? Everything went down again because every one of their drives were thin provisioned and every one of them were fighting for that 2 gig that guy freed up. So I took production down twice in about 40 minutes for these guys because they thin provisioned their drives. So don't be that person. Don't thin provision those drives. And your virtualization guys, if it's not you, if you've got a virtualization team, they're going to fight you on that. And the other thing to keep in mind is if your virtualization software does anything crazy like snapshots, periodic things, I had that take a customer down too. We had done all the calculations, we were ready to go, but they had their backups that would take snapshots and then pull them off. Snapshot ran in the middle of an upgrade. Everything paused, destroyed everything. So be very aware, don't thin provision. The other thing, we don't have it on here, but there's another SQL guy, Brent Ozar, O-Z-A-R. For the SQL MCM readiness videos, he made one of those on virtualizing SQL. It is amazing. How he did not win an Oscar for that video, I have no idea. It's about 70 minutes, 75 minutes, something like that. And it is all about virtualizing SQL and best practices. If you're going to have to virtualize SQL, I recommend watching that video. If you've got a DBA team, get some popcorn, dim the lights, make them watch it too. It brings up crazy things like having more virtual CPUs is not a good thing. You can have too many virtual CPUs. Things like that. It was really eye-opening for us. I probably watched it 10 times just because there's so much good stuff in it, and I'm a slow learner. So you can look for that.
That's an important part.
But be very careful. Don't do the overcommitting of RAM, things like that, because you will pay for it with SharePoint.
Yeah. How many of you are going to build your farm on completely physical gear? I see one guy. That's telling.
Wow.
Interesting.
Yeah.
All right, someone's about to ask a question.
Brent Ozar, O-Z-A-R. And I probably got a link to it somewhere on my blog, but it's the SQL MCM readiness videos. They're on TechEd. There's a bunch of them, but his is on virtualization. You can't go wrong. And Brent's a good presenter. It's very entertaining to listen to, but just all kinds of, because I remember, Shane and I have been virtualizing stuff for a while. I thought we knew the high points. The first time I watched it, I emailed him. He was like, you got to watch this. We know nothing. You got to watch this. So it's very good.
All right.
And there's that link for the hardware for SQL was on that last slide.
Okay, so sometimes SharePoint isn't enough. I know that's hard to believe.
Who are these people that aren't satisfied with SharePoint?
But quickly here we wanted to talk about some of the different bolt-ons, if you will, for SharePoint. So project server, that one comes up a lot. There's probably some project server sessions this week.
Yep.
Because really to get your bang for your buck in project server, you've got to integrate it with SharePoint.
Well, it sits on top of SharePoint, so yeah.
With that, it does require SharePoint 2013 Enterprise CALs, so it is going to require expensive SharePoint. One of the things that I often caution people, and it's not as bad as it used to be, but what I will tell you is that if you're going to kick the tires on project server or just test it out for a couple of people, avoid the temptation just to slap it on your production server because it has to be part of SharePoint. Project Server fundamentally changes SharePoint. It introduces some new service apps. It adds new templates, new workflow stuff. It's one of those things that when you go to do an upgrade later, you don't want to be like, crap, now I've got to upgrade and patch Project Server, which we're not even using anymore because I was a dumb, almost said ass, and I can't say ass.
You can't say ass.
I was a dumb butt and put it on my production server. So we run into that a lot. I like to see Project Server kept over in the corner until either it goes mainstream or you've got a real good purpose for it, because it doesn't feel good for me on top of SharePoint, for my collaboration forum, I should say.
Yeah, and that brings up another point, and we deal with this all the time, and it's a phrase that I stole from somebody very wise, and the person said, the question isn't whether you have a test farm, the question is whether you have a production farm. And so just like he said, don't test this on production. Don't make the farm that you think is your production farm your test farm by doing things like putting project on it. And that counts for everything, but it's an important thing.
Yep. SQL Server Reporting Services, it still bolts on top of SharePoint. It now is a service application. You'd want to use SQL Server 2012 SP1. We should have had SP1 written on that slide. It's another thing, right? It's going to fundamentally change SharePoint. It adds a lot of new pieces to the puzzle. Yep. Now, I'm a big fan of it. SQL Server Reporting Services in SharePoint integration mode is a wonderful thing. But once again, don't kick the tires on it in production. Let's have a plan for testing that.
Yep. Another great one is the Office web apps. So it is my opinion that every one of you that installs SharePoint 2013 should install the Office web apps 2013. The great deal is that the read part of it is free. So really the only expense to you is it has to run on its own server. You can't install it on a SharePoint server. You can't install it on an Exchange server. Because one of the little quirks, one of the little things that the Office web apps like to do is when you uninstall them, they like to reset IIS. Everything in IIS goes away, whether Office web apps put it there or not. So you don't want to share servers with that. But what it gives you is this ability in browser to render Word, Excel, PowerPoint, OneNote, PDF files in browser for your users. And it integrates that all over. It integrates it in search results. You can get pop-ups. It integrates it inside of document libraries. And again, the read part of that is free for everybody. You can just install it, hook the two together. There's a coding process, an exchange of GIFs, and then SharePoint and the Office web apps work together. If you have Exchange 2013, you can use the same Office web apps farm and render those same Office documents inside of Outlook Anywhere. Is that what they're calling it now? Outlook Anywhere. If you have Link, same deal. So it's just a great thing. If you want to create an edit, that takes a license, but it's licensed with the Office client. So if you already have Office client licenses, whoever has those licenses can also use that to edit and create. Great stuff. The install is not intuitive. It doesn't have our friend, the prerequisite installer and all that. But that link there, that GoToMeeting link, is a webinar that one of our coworkers did that walks you through the process. Not much to it. Get it all set up, bolted into SharePoint. Can't go wrong. I'm a big fan of the Office web apps.
Yeah, and if you're on the fence with Office web apps, you're like, why would I need them or anything like that? The biggest answer, the easiest answer today is it's those darn iPads, right? How many of you have an iPad running around the office, right? I mean, you're executive, exactly. Everyone's got iPads running around.
I smell them in the crowd right now. Yeah.
But with those things, right? One of the big challenges is the fact that we can't do Word, Excel, PowerPoint. Now you can do it in the browser. And then as soon as that executive guy finds out, oh, I can edit this PowerPoint in the browser if we just buy another license, how hard is it to get him to sign that check? It's not, right? He wants what he wants. So that to me has been the big driver for Office web apps. Now I will tell you that we have people within our group and our company that even though they're sitting at their desktop running Windows 8 with Office 2013, they still prefer to use Office web apps for most of their activities because they're getting into the customer library to look at statements of work and things like that. They don't want to wait on it to download and Word to open and then Word to say, do you want to enable editing and all that crap? They like just being able to go to the SharePoint site, click on the document, boom, the Word document opens right there in the browser. They can find the hours for the install task, copy that down, and move on. So Office web apps, because they're free, like Todd said, every one of you should install them.
Yep. Finally, another thing that we're seeing a lot of in the BI stack is Power Pivot. That's a way for Excel and all that to deal with really huge amounts of data. That's one of those things that requires SQL Server 2012 SP1, requires SharePoint Server Enterprise.
So Power Pivot requires SQL Enterprise and SharePoint Enterprise.
Enterprise. So if you have a pile of money burning in your parking lot somewhere and can't figure out where to spend it, Power Pivot's a great way to take care of that.
Yeah. Power Pivot's one of those tough ones because the server-side components, so it requires SQL Server Enterprise and SharePoint Enterprise. So if you've already got SharePoint Enterprise, like, SQL Enterprise. But SQL and SharePoint have to be installed on the same box. Right? So you can't use your back-end Excel or SQL box that you've already got up and running and just upgrade that to Enterprise. You've got to go pick one of the app servers in your farm, get the SQL Server Enterprise CD out, and install it on that particular box. So that's a whole nother SQL Enterprise license. Like Todd said, short of if you got money to burn, I get customers all the time like, I want to play with this Power Pivot thing. I want to try it out. I'm like, that's great, dude. You got 6 figures to kick the tires of this thing. We can do it.
And our hourly rate just went up.
Yeah.
They got that kind of money.
So I like Power Pivot. It's got a lot of great features. Power Pivot, what's the Power View?
Power View, yeah.
Right. So Power View is like the next iteration of it, which is sort of amazing. But they're very expensive at this point in time.
Yep. And it's, again, for huge amounts of data.
All right. Where's my clicker?
So this is just kind of a quick cheat sheet sort of which SKU of SharePoint you need, what it adds, whether it has databases, and whether you can publish it cross-farm. So we've talked to some folks this week that have like an enterprise farm that has search and user profile, and they publish that down to the other SharePoint farms. This is kind of the cheat sheet for this. You'll notice some of these service applications like user profile and search have multiple databases. Access services will have one database for every Access app your users create. So I didn't want to fill the slide with all of those, but those are up there too. So that's all of those.
All right, so we're going to switch gears for a minute here and kind of talk a little bit about topologies. Same as it was in 7 and 10, right? We have really 3 different tiers. We've got the web app tier, or the web front ends. One of my customers calls those the wife servers. I don't know.
And they do that, and every time it's like, I'm going to put this on the wife, and it always takes me like, what?
Yeah, so whatever. But
do not encourage that behavior.
The web front ends, right? That's the tier of servers that are actually going to be running IIS and share the pages. When you type in portal.contoso.com, that's the server that's rendering that. If you've got multiple web front ends, you're going to have to introduce some form of load balancing, whether it be Windows Network load balancing or big fancy F5s or round robin DNS if you're really poor.
Yep. So the bad news about like network load balancing in Windows is I'm pretty sure it hasn't changed since Windows 2003.
The name changed.
But the good news is if you set it up 10 years ago, you still have all those skills, you're good to go. But yeah, otherwise you've got these expensive boxes that do fancy stuff and all that.
Well, we had a client that had 25,000 users going through Windows Network load balancing, and it never skipped a beat. I mean, it did fine.
Yeah, it's just dumb. It's not application aware, so yeah.
So that's the web tier. From there, you have the application tier, and that's pretty much what we use just to encapsulate everything else. So your search servers, your BI servers, your user profile servers, all of those guys. Because when it comes to the app tier, there's a lot of mixing and matching we can do, but any server that's running a service app, that's generally what we think about.
One new change from SharePoint 2010 to SharePoint 2013 is search was essentially rewritten. Microsoft bought a company called Fast in 2009, and they bought that, or 2008, and they bought it they bought it too close to the SharePoint 2010 release to kind of integrate the two. This version of SharePoint, there's no such thing as Fast Server anymore. There's just SharePoint Search, and it's got a lot of the Fast goodness in it. But one of the things that we lose is the Manage Topologies link in Central Admin. So when you create your search service app, SharePoint is going to put all of the roles on your Central Admin server, no matter what. Probably not the place you want to put it. If you're going to have a farm of any size, you probably want search off onto its own server because those node runner processes are going to fight against each other and try to steal all the CPUs and the RAMs. So you're going to probably want to move that off to its own server. You can't do it in the UI anymore. You used to be able to. You're not seeing things. There used to be a button. There's not anymore. So now you have to do it with PowerShell. It's about 10 lines of PowerShell. Not intuitive, but if you go out on the internet, there's 100 places where it's documented. But you're going to have to go out and recreate that topology yourself in PowerShell and push it out. That is not on my blog, only because after I figured it out, I noticed everybody already had it blogged. So I just haven't redone it. But
So one of the things I'd caution you about with search, before we keep rolling here, but one of the things I'll caution you with is, I was one of those people, I wrote a whole book on search back in 2008. I knew SharePoint 2007, 2010 search about as well as I think I could. That actually makes it harder for me to understand search in 2013, right? Because they've pretty much completely changed how it all works. So I go into a 2013 search with all these preconceived notions about how things should be connected and how they should behave. And some are right, some are wrong. So I would caution you guys, the more you know about 2010 search, the harder 2013 search is actually going to be for you. So don't take it for granted and be like, oh, I don't need to pay attention to any of those search topics. I already know all I need to know about search. Search is harder for those of us that knew it pretty well last time.
Well, so his question was about the topology. Our next couple of slides are going to be about specific topologies, but your search server, it's got 5 roles now, and so we used to tell everybody, run the query role on your web front ends, run everything else on an app server. I'm kind of getting away from that. We'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. But what we're talking about here is when these 5 roles come up, put them on another app server. Not on a web front end, but on their own app server somewhere to get that load off. Because search does a lot more things now than it did. And so okay, so if you have a fast server, it's the same kind of deal, because fast had to be on its own server. So same kind of deal. Now, like I said, we got some topology slides after this. Redundancy of the app servers. So his question is, how do you make the app servers redundant? Trying to think of any exceptions, but for the most part, an app server is just a catch-all name for a server running non-web front-end service instances. And so for most of them, the way you make them fault-tolerant or redundant is when you have them running on more than one server. So you create your farm, you go into manage applications, service applications, and you create Excel services, for instance. That creates it in the farm, that puts some entries in the config database, but it doesn't do anything anywhere yet. So before you can actually consume Excel services, you need to go to the service instances or the services on server and start that on a machine. That machine, in this case, is going to be your app server. If you want that to be fault tolerant, you just need to start that on another machine somewhere. And if the first machine goes down, the second machine will respond to those requests. And SharePoint load balances all that for you, so you don't have to worry about switching that over. The web front end role, it doesn't. But the service apps, it does.
You want to show it real quick?
Yeah, you can. And the other thing about that is, let's say you don't make it fault tolerant. You're sleeping through this part of the session. I don't blame you. And your box that's running Excel services just crashes, explodes, and you didn't set it on another one. No problem. As long as you can get into Central Admin or PowerShell, you can just fire it up on another box. All the settings are in your config database, so it'll just pull them out and bring it online.
Yep. So the managed service application screen, right, just to hit the screens Todd just talked about. So this is where we would create the Excel services service app, right? So that makes it available in our farm. So this is just making the instance of that available in the farm.
And notice there's no reference to machine names anywhere there. It's all farm level.
So then if we go to manage services on server, this is where we are going to start the service instance that powers it. So when he said start Excel on 2 servers, so here you can see I'm managing server 01. Right, I could then click change server, change to server 02, also start Excel on that box, and now I've made that one
Yep. Now, thing about that is a couple of them don't do that. So the user profile sync service cannot be started on more than one box without hysterical results. And I'm trying to think, there's another one that I think you can't. But for the most part, that's how you make them fault tolerant.
All right. Back to here. And then the database tier, we hit that one pretty good earlier.
Yeah, we talked about that.
All right. So this is our main starting point, all the SharePoint on one box, SQL on the other. The idea is if we can get you to start here, right, it's real easy to scale up. You just buy another box or spin up another VM, add it to the farm, spread out some load, no big deal.
And the way that you do that, and we're going to talk about the next slide, is that screen that Shane was just on. Load your second box up, and then just go juggle those service instances around. And that's nothing to it. I will say we've been doing this thing forever. SharePoint 2007, that was a pretty viable thing. SharePoint 2010, mostly could do that. SharePoint 2013, this is like a test environment. This is, you'll have a trouble making this work in production. Just so much going on. We demand so much from SharePoint. We're like, we want it to be social, we want it to do this, we want it to do that. And for the most part, Microsoft delivers on a lot of these demands. But there's a pound of flesh. We got to give them something back. And the thing that we have to give them back is resources. And it's getting tougher and tougher to run everything on one box.
So here is that exact example. 2 boxes kind of running. And in a scenario like this, we've got 2 SharePoint boxes and 1 SQL. Generally speaking, we run everything on both boxes. We're trying to make these 2 boxes, we're adding redundancy here a lot of times more than trying to add capacity. You will also notice that Todd made this slide, look, I got a pointer, and that this arrow is pointing the wrong way. Todd, would you like to talk about where this arrow is pointing?
So one of us isn't real great at Visio. And I don't think it's important to point fingers or name names or shame anybody. And one of us may have spent about an hour trying to figure out how to get the arrow head on the other end of that line and just gave up. So
that's how you know that I've ascended to the manager, the director role, right? Because I understand how to use Visio now.
PowerPoint, Visio, there's none higher. So, and the reason we bring that up, well, the reason he brings that up is to embarrass me in front of a room full of people. But the reason that I bring it up is don't be confused by the way those arrows go, because they are pointing the wrong direction. And despite him bragging about how great he is with Visio, he refuses to fix the slide.
It's a true story. Moss Trace, Todd was also showing his Espanol. So here in this scenario, what he really did, and this is what, I would almost say we were thinking is a minimum config, because the idea is that we've got everything running on that first box, and we took this box and we really just put the search pieces on it. Right? The idea is that all those 5 roles that search carries, and the node runners and the constant consuming of my RAM is all happening on this one box. So when it gets mad, search is upset, search is slow, and indexing is slow, but my users are always happy because they're always interacting with this box that's actually pretty undertaxed. Yeah?
So back to talking about Office Web Apps needing its own server, is that going to be included?
So he said, hey, guys, you said we needed Office Web Apps on its own server. That's a great point. Unfortunately, someone who's not very good at Visio didn't think about putting Office Web Apps in here. So if you were going to have Office Web Apps like we talked about, there would just be another server. It can't be on a box. The rule with Office Web Apps is no other Microsoft product can be installed. So not SQL, not Exchange, not Link, not SharePoint. Office Web Apps need to be on their box themselves. And the main reason that usually Todd would tell you for that is when you patch Office Web Apps, you don't actually patch them as much as you uninstall them and reinstall the new version. And when you uninstall them, they wipe out IIS. Right, so imagine if you find a way, you show us how smart you are, and you get it on one of your SharePoint servers. How happy is SharePoint going to be when Office Web Apps wipes out IIS?
Yep.
So
use your imagination and imagine a very bright, shining Office Web Apps server at the bottom there. Well, you had to install the Office Web Apps on SharePoint 2010. You can't install them on SharePoint 2013. Yeah.
Yes. Other than need another piece of hardware.
Going to put on whatever box central admin's on. Then you move it, yep.
Okay.
Notice I didn't try to fight with the arrows there.
Quattro. Oh. Maybe you should talk for a minute. I'm getting tired of picking on you.
Do you need some time to laugh over there and catch your breath?
They're getting a chuckle unabashedly.
So this is kind of a combination of the last two. We've got search on its own tier so that those node runner processes can just gobble up every resource. But yet we've got fault tolerance now because we've got the web front end and our other service apps running on 2 boxes. So if either of the first 2 boxes dies, hopefully your end users won't be able to tell. Your load balancer will send them to the other box, depending which end of the arrow it listens to. And if the search box dies, all that you lose is search. So you will lose, like, new documents won't get queried or won't get indexed, queries won't get answered, but SharePoint itself won't die. Now, I say that with a caveat, though, because there's a bunch of parts of SharePoint now that use search whether you know it or not. And so if search goes down, things might break that you might not expect. The other thing is there's this great new web part called the Content by Search web part, where it's kind of like a fancy search results web part. You can take this web part and give it rules, and it will render content out of the index on a live page, so the page is always up to date and all that. Obviously, search has to be running for that to work. But this gives you fault-tolerant web front ends and applications without search being fault-tolerant.
So in this slide, we won't really spend any time on. Just clearly ignore this slide. But
notice the arrows are in the wrong direction.
So this is that same type of thing, right? This is just more scale, more breaking out pieces. So now in this one, the top, these two guys, right? We're putting search up here in a redundant fashion. We've got these two guys that are doing all the app server stuff in a redundant fashion. This might be your normal SQL Server for all your content. And then we're even talking about putting SQL Server for search only on its own machine.
So that it can pound those databases as much as it wants and all that.
I mean, literally, search is just the most violent thing that can ever happen.
Tremendous. Ellis.
As far as scaling goes, were these quick designs for search, specifically how many items would involve small versus
So his question was how many items, at what thresholds do you upgrade those? I don't remember. It's published out there. It's in this is a SharePoint 2013 sizing document, white paper. Okay. 10 million per server. Well, so the rule, go out, look in your thing. All these sessions are being recorded. There you go, 10 million queries for a 4-core VM. But go out, so like Shane was saying before, search has changed a lot, so go out in a week or so, all these recordings will be out there. Listen to that search session, you'll learn a lot, and you'll learn that. Yep, we'll get to that. Yep. So this is, so this breaks it up, and we've got query, all that, search, gets its own databases.
So then this is a slide I have to point out Todd's good skills. So instead of fixing the Visio, see his upside down exclamation points. He nailed it in this one. His mouse grande. There you go. Give him a little love.
So this is just one of those ridiculous pie in the sky things. But the purpose of this slide is not to give you a diagram. Don't go implement this. But it's just to point out the scaling points, the places where if things start getting taxed, the pieces you can pull out. We've kind of beat the search thing to death, so we know about that. You'll notice in the upper right-hand corner there, we've got the distributed cache. We haven't talked a lot about that, but every SharePoint 2013 farm has the distributed cache, and if you don't touch it, it runs on all your servers. It takes 10% of their RAM, and each one of those servers caches things that happen a lot, search results and things being part of that, but also authentication tokens. And all the servers cache different bits, but they share each other's cache. In big farms, you can actually have too many cache servers. And so you may end up needing to break those out into their own servers. So that's one thing that you can do. Another thing that we did in this on the lower right-hand side is we've got a SQL instance and databases just for BI. So maybe that's for licensing reasons, maybe that's for drive I/O contention reasons, but that's another thing that we can split out. We've also got a couple of servers that are just running BI bits, giving them full control of the machine. Yes, sir? When would you have distributed cache implemented? Every single SharePoint 2013 farm. SharePoint will fall to its knees without the distributed cache running. It caches a bunch of stuff there.
The key is it's installed automatically.
It's all installed automatically, yeah. When would you split out the distributed cache? So the reasons you would split up the distributed cache, again, you can actually have too many cache servers. And I think it's 4 per farm or supported, or 8, something like that. So if you have more servers than that in your farm, you're going to need to divvy that up. Also, the things that caches, authentication and search, maybe you're using those heavily. So you want to get a couple boxes, dedicate 12 gig of RAM to the distributed cache on a box, because you can configure that a little bit. I would say, though, that if you don't know why you should fiddle with distributed cache, and I'm not calling you out, but if you don't know why, don't touch it. because you will you will kill SharePoint if you poke that the wrong way. Remember how the user profile service in the last version was a 1.0 thing, and if you poked it wrong, we're a first version distributed cache. And that is built on a thing called App Fabric. So you're going to notice some shortcuts on your server for App Fabric. Don't touch those. Pretend they don't exist. Hold your thumb over the icons when you're, because that's what this is in the background, and it will destroy it. Have a question in the back there?
Yes, in a larger farm, would it be recommended to put the distributed cache on the web front ends or the application?
So his question is, if you've got a large farm and you need to split the distributed cache up and you want to put it on servers, where should you put it? I'm going to say web front end, but I'm also going to tell you that I'm one of those guys that doesn't feel confident diddling with the distributed cache much, so I mostly don't fool with it. I'm a little afraid of it.
Well, we have 4 web front ends and 2 app services and a search server.
Yeah, so you're going to have to go do your homework on it based on the size of your farm.
Yeah, and I think there's even a health analyzer rule that probably fires because of the distributed cache, having too many servers or too much RAM or something. So we can take that offline, though. I don't want to get down in a rabbit hole on that here.
So, yeah.
Is that going to be a PowerShell config change, or is it
Yeah, so his question is about the distributed cache. Yeah, that's all PowerShell. Yep.
Which is how you know they don't want you messing with it. Yeah. All right. So changing gears now, we want to hit on the install process for just a second. So this is obviously what we spent 8 hours on Sunday talking about. But when it comes to the install, if you've installed SharePoint 2007 or 2010, it is darn near the same process. From a core steps, right? We got to get the prereqs on there. Once we get the prereqs on there, we're going to run the install of the setup.exe stuff. Once we've got the setup.exe stuff, we've got to use config wizard or some mechanism to create a farm. And then we've got to use central admin or more PowerShell to create the actual service apps and add all the functionality. So that has not changed. Instead of running down that...
yeah, we're running it. Yeah, so let's keep going.
Oh. So when you run the setup here, a couple of the same rules as we had in 2010. So the install account, and you should be using a dedicated install account. And Todd's got a nice blog post there on the different install accounts and what they're used for, what roles they have, what permissions they need. It is. I give you credit on that one. Just that one, though. With the install account, though, you have to be a local administrator on all the SharePoint boxes, just like you always have. And you have to have the SQL Server roles of DB creator, public, and security admin. We don't know where it came from, but we had a rash of people recently editing that public role. Once again, tell your DBAs to stay the hell away from the SharePoint and SQL boxes and leave it be. Let it do its thing. When you're looking at all this, you're going to have to look at updates. This is Todd's other good blog post, right? He has 2. He has the service accounts and the build numbers. And so here, Todd tracks all the different cumulative updates and or service packs when they start appearing for SharePoint. What's the short answer on that? Be careful? Is that?
Yeah, so the patching scene for SharePoint 2013 has changed a little from 2010. We had a patch in March, the first ever public update, and Microsoft has said that patch will be required for every future update. So you have to have that one. And I confirmed that in April, when we got our first cumulative update, it would not install without the March public update. So I guess the public updates you got to put on. Cumulative updates, my guidance is staying the same. Don't install them unless you can point in the knowledge base article for that cumulative update which problem you have that it fixes. April cumulative update, for instance, came out, broke SharePoint. So don't install it just because it's out there. You're not cool if your build number is higher than your buddy's build number. Don't install cumulative updates just because they're out. If you do decide you want to install one, install it in a test environment first because you can't uninstall them. Let it run for a month. Microsoft has removed the download for cumulative updates 31 days after the update came out. Updates have been out for an entire month, destroying SharePoint farms before they actually pulled it off their site. So let it set for a while, percolate. On my build list, for every build, I've got a notes and regressions link, a little wiki there. As I find out about problems with a build, I add it to that list. So before you put a patch out there, go out there, see what things it breaks, and then check again periodically. Eric. Would I install cumulative updates on a new build? Since this is a SharePoint 2013 session, no. I would install the public update on a fresh install, but we only have one cumulative update, and it's crap. It's broken. If you install it on a brand new farm, it won't run. The config wizard will break. So don't install that one. In the future, though, yes. And I've got a document. If you go to toddclint.com/TechEd2013, it's all the notes from our Sunday thing, but it's got that build list in there. When I'm building a new farm, I run all the bits, I install everything, and then I install whatever patch level I want it to be at before I create anything. So as we get 2 or 3 cumulative updates down the road and one of them's good, then I would install that.
But just to reiterate, so if I was going to install SharePoint tomorrow when I get back to the office,
Tomorrow, yep.
you would put the March
public update and stop. And then install service packs as soon as is responsible. Those are tested fairly well. Microsoft has changed distribution models for SharePoint now. They're doing this whole SharePoint every 18 months thing. So we're still kind of figuring out how all this works for the patches and what's being tested and all that. But again, that link's going to have everything that I know about it.
So configuring SharePoint, one of the big things that we have always hated about SharePoint is its quest to run the world out of GUIDs, with database names with GUIDs and things like that. So Todd and I are big fans of building it all through PowerShell and very methodically around database names. So the good news is that that first link up there, that is about an hour-and-a-half long recorded webinar of me going through an install.
It's horrible.
Actually doing the setup and then showing you the PowerShell pieces I use versus the things I do in Central Admin and kind of mixing it through. So that would be a very handy thing if you're looking for the actual install process. Also, on the second link there, that is all the scripts that we used in our Sunday all-day webinar. So those are available to you guys as well. That is every ounce of PowerShell Todd can cobble together for building a farm. So.
Yep. All right. So the next slide is search. We've kind of covered all that. We're running out of time, so I don't want to rehash all of that. Got a bunch of the fast stuff. You got to use PowerShell to rebuild it. There's all the components.
Lots of good search sessions this week with people way smarter than us at search.
Way smarter. User profile service, not a lot has changed with the user profile service. The good news is it's still FIM, it's still broken in all the great ways that we've learned to love in SharePoint 2010.
That's not the positive spin you were supposed to put on that
So you
slide.
got that going for you. The one change is they brought back the SharePoint 2007 AD import mode. So that was faster. You could use LDAP filters instead of these crazy ones that we got with FIM, but it was read-only. So if that's okay with you, if you don't mind faster imports and you don't need to write back to AD, you can flip that switch. And it's a little switch after you get things set up. And it is a confusing toggle between SharePoint import and Active Directory import, which is confusing when you're importing Active Directory to SharePoint, because all those words are in every definition. But you're looking for the SharePoint import. That's the 2007 mode. Other than that, it's exactly the same. The setup's the same. The requirements are the same. The accounts are the same. It's all the same.
Same.
Here's another one. This next one is one that I like, that's been kind of cool, is SkyDrive Pro. So this was something that was incredibly confusing when the SharePoint beta came out, so I kind of dug into it to figure out what it was. The most important thing is to remember that SkyDrive Pro has absolutely nothing to do with SkyDrive. Nothing to do with SkyDrive. The reason that it's got this name is because Microsoft wants you to think of it as like a private SkyDrive, like your company SkyDrive, your company storing stuff in the cloud, but there is no connection. They don't get together at family reunions or anything like that. It's nothing to do with SkyDrive. But what it does is it gives you a handy link. If you look up there in the top of that screenshot, there's a handy SkyDrive link that takes you to SkyDrive Pro. You can't make this stuff up. But what that is that's just a quick link to your MySite Documents library. So your MySite Documents library is your SharePoint or your SkyDrive Pro library. And for maximum confusion, as if your head wasn't completely spinning now, SkyDrive Pro is also the client and the functionality that syncs you up to your SkyDrive Pro folder. So it is a place and a technology. And that's important because SkyDrive Pro will let you sync offline non-SkyDrive Pro libraries. So when we were planning this, we had all of our documents and all that out on SharePoint, and I used SkyDrive Pro. I synced up that shared document library, It's out on my laptop now, so all those files. So you may have seen this before as SharePoint Workspaces or Groove. And when you install SkyDrive Pro, it actually is groove.exe.
Is it really?
It really is, yep.
Gosh.
So I've got a link there, and that's just my blog post on it with some questions about how you can configure it and all that. Also, a couple of weeks ago, they released a standalone installer for this. So you used to have to get Office 2013 to get the SkyDrive Pro client. Now you can download it standalone. It works with SharePoint 2013 and SharePoint 2010. So you can download it now and all that. You got a question? So as far as I know, there is not a Mac client currently. So no. No Mac, no RT client currently. So that's it. Okay, so we've got our resources slide. Let's
Yeah,
see.
we got all the slides that they added for us.
So I lied to you. I didn't mention the Workflow Manager. He asked about that before. The Workflow Manager is a new thing in SharePoint 2013. It builds on top of the old workflow engine in SharePoint 2010. It is a separate install, a separate thing, a separate product, but it can be installed on your SharePoint boxes. And we would go so far as to say that you should install it on your SharePoint boxes simply because it doesn't seem to take a lot of resources, doesn't hurt anything, and it's easy to scale. You cannot run SharePoint 2013 workflows without it. SharePoint 2013 comes with the SharePoint 2010 workflow out of the box. So when you install SharePoint 2013 and attach that crusty SharePoint 2010 database, all of your SharePoint 2010 workflows will run. If you want the additional stuff, you need 2013.
All right, let's let these fine folks go on to their next set of sessions.
Yep, please fill out your evaluations. Thank you very much.